When people picture ancient Rome, they picture men, senators arguing in togas, generals conquering Gaul, philosophers making everything worse by having opinion. And that picture is not entirely wrong. It just leaves out roughly half the population who were actually there, running the households, managing the finances, performing the sacred rites, and occasionally, when the mood struck, toppling a political career or two. Roman women lived inside one of the most complicated legal and social environments in the ancient world, a world where a woman could own property but not vote, divorce her husband but not speak in court, and hold enormous household authority, while technically classified as the legal ward of a man who might be living 3 provinces away. The Roman ideal of womanhood was simple and boring by design: virtuous, wool, working, modest, devoted to husband and household. The actual Roman woman was frequently something else, running businesses, practicing medicine, wielding influence over emperors, and doing all of it while navigating a legal system that was, depending on the century and her class, either surprisingly progressive or casually hostile. The gap between what Rome claimed women were and what Roman women actually did is one of the most compelling stories in ancient history. The legal labyrinth: citizen, ward, and complication. Roman law had a fundamental problem with women. Freeborn Roman women were, technically, citizens. They could own property, inherit wealth, enter contracts, and conduct substantial financial business. But they could not vote, hold political office, serve in the military, or speak in court on their own behalf. Their position in Roman law was a paradox held together by tradition and convenience. The central concept, shaping a Roman woman's legal life, was the pater familias, the male head of household, whose authority, patria potestas, extended over everyone under his roof. Technically, this authority included the power of life and death over adult daughters. In practice, by the late Republic, this had softened considerably, but it never entirely vanished. What persisted was the tutela mulierum, a guardianship requirement that meant adult women needed a male tutor to authorize major transactions, making a will, selling property, signing significant financial contracts. The important detail is that this guardianship had, by the late Republic, become largely ceremonial for women of means. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century CE, admitted openly that the requirement for female guardianship was hard to justify rationally. Since women managed their own affairs perfectly well, he described it, essentially, as a legal formality that nobody took seriously anymore. There were official escapes from the system entirely. Women who bore 3 children, 4 if they were freed women, qualified for the ius liberorum, a legal status introduced by Augustus that freed them from needing a tutor at all. Augustus, obsessed with boosting Rome's birth rate, had accidentally built a female legal independence incentive into his family legislation. Have enough children and you earn your freedom from male legal supervision. The Roman state, accidentally pragmatic about women's autonomy, occasionally. Marriage, the family business dressed up in a flame-colored veil. Roman girls could legally marry at 12, boys at 14. These minimums were set by law. Actual marriages for girls happened more often in the mid-teens, but the institution was entirely about family alliances, property, and producing legitimate heirs. Nobody was asking whether the couple were in love, though love was treated as a nice bonus if it happened. There were 2 marriage forms, and the distinction is crucial. Cum manu marriage, with the hand, transferred a woman completely out of her birth family's legal sphere and into her husband's. Her property became his. She was, legally, like his daughter. By the time of Julius Caesar, this form had largely fallen out of use among the elite, replaced by sign manu marriage, without the hand, in which a wife moved into her husband's home but remained legally connected to her birth family. Her property stayed separate from his. His debts were not her debts. If her father died, she inherited from him, not through her husband's family line. The practical result of this shift was that wealthy Roman women of the late Republic and Empire had substantially more financial independence than most of their successors in European history for the next 15 centuries. Property between spouses was so legally separated that gifts between a husband and wife were considered legally void, technically classified as conditional loans, that the giver could reclaim if the marriage ended. The Romans were quite serious about this. The wedding ceremony was elaborate but legally optional. Roman marriage required no state registration, no mandatory religious ceremony, no specific formality. What mattered legally was the intention to be married and the establishment of a shared household. The ceremony was traditional: auspices taken, contracts signed, a sacrifice performed. The bride wore the flammeum, the flame-colored veil, and her hair was arranged in 6 sections separated by an iron-tipped pin called the hasta liberis, because iron was associated with warding off evil. She was carried over the threshold and declared, "Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia," a formula so ancient that Romans of the classical period no longer knew its origin. The dowry was the marriage's financial foundation, provided by the bride's family, administered by the husband, but always legally hers. In a divorce, it came back. He could not sell or mortgage dowry property without her consent. It functioned as a woman's financial insurance policy, and the negotiations around it were serious enough to fill courts with litigation. Divorce. Easier than most people expect. This is the part that surprises people who have absorbed their ancient history from films. Roman divorce was easy. The standard sine manual marriage of the late Republic could be dissolved by either party simply by declaring the intent to end it. No court required. No magistrate to petition, no waiting period. A spouse who wanted out informed witnesses, and the marriage was legally over. Women could initiate divorce, men could initiate divorce. Either party could do so for any reason or no stated reason at all. The formal notice was called repudium, traditionally something men sent to women, but women sent it right back when they wanted to. Cicero's daughter Tullia divorced her second husband. Cato the Younger famously gave his wife Marcia to his friend Hortensius. She went, had children with Hortensius, and Cato took her back after Hortensius died, and Roman sources recorded this as odd, rather than scandalous. Seneca complained that some Roman women counted their years not by consuls but by husbands. The financial mechanics were clear. The dowry returned to the wife. Property she had brought into the marriage in her own name remained hers. What the husband kept was what had always been his. Augustus's Lex Iulia legislation punished adultery and tried to incentivize marriage and reproduction, but it did not restrict the right to divorce itself. The Roman state never claimed the right to keep a marriage together against both parties' wishes. The significant cost of divorce for women was custody. Children went, by default, to the father, as products of his legitimate family line. A divorcing woman generally could not keep her children under Roman law, which was a real and painful consequence. Wealthy women with resources and connections often maintained access to their children anyway, because the law was not always the final word, but the legal default was stark. Running the house, the domina, and her empire of one roof. If Roman public life excluded women from formal power structures, Roman private life handed them something functionally similar: the household. The Roman domus was a significant economic unit, and the woman who ran it, the domina, wielded genuine authority within its walls. The domina managed the household accounts, supervised the enslaved workers who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the property, educated the young children before they were handed to formal tutors, received visitors in the atrium, and maintained the household's religious observances. Even a moderately wealthy Roman household might include dozens of enslaved people and generate income through urban properties or agricultural holdings. The domina was, effectively, the chief operating officer of a small enterprise. Woolworking, the lanificium that Roman writers loved to invoke as the symbol of female virtue, was genuine household management, not a hobby. A Roman household produced cloth, for slaves' clothing, household textiles, family garments. The domina oversaw this production, even if, by the late Republic, many wealthy women had stopped personally working the wool and simply managed the enslaved workers who did. When Augustus reportedly wore homespun cloth made by his wife Livia and daughter Julia, Roman writers presented this as admirable traditional virtue, and noted it as remarkable precisely because it had become unfashionable among the elite. The management of enslaved people was itself an art Roman writers discussed seriously. A good domina maintained order, without cruelty, in theory. The reality varied wildly. Enslaved women in a Roman household existed in profound precarity, subject to the master's sexual demands, the mistress's authority, and a legal system that recognized them as property. Relations between enslaved women and their mistresses ranged from something approaching genuine care to documented brutality, and both portraits appear in Roman sources as accurate descriptions of different households, class, work, and the enormous distance between them. Roman woman is almost a meaningless category without specifying class. The patrician wife of a senator and the freedwoman running a bakery and the enslaved woman grinding grain in the back of a workshop all lived in the same city under theoretically the same laws, and their lives shared almost nothing. Upper-class women could exercise the legal rights that technically applied to all freeborn women but practically required money and connections to use. They hired lawyers. They managed properties through educated freedmen agents. They were educated, often in Greek, literature, music, and philosophy. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was famous for her learning, and her surviving letters were cited as models of Latin prose. She personally oversaw the education of her sons, Tiberius and Gaius, the reforming tribunes, and was considered a formative influence on their political careers. Plebeian women were funerary inscriptions, some of our best evidence for ordinary Roman life. Record women identifying themselves by trade: wool merchant, midwife, weaver, innkeeper, fish dealer, dye worker. One inscription records a woman as a ship's captain. The evidence is fragmentary but consistent. Working-class Roman women participated actively in the Roman economy, often running family businesses alongside or independent of their husbands. Freedwomen, formerly enslaved women who had been manumitted, occupied a specific and surprisingly advantageous niche. Manumission was common in Rome. A freed woman became a Roman citizen, with most of the rights that entailed. She retained obligations to her former owner, the patronus, but she was legally free. Freed women built businesses and accumulated property, and some became genuinely wealthy. Several of the most financially powerful women in Roman documentary records are freed women or their descendants. Enslaved women had no legal rights. They were property. Their children belonged to their owner. They could not legally marry. Their relationships, called contubernium, had no legal standing. Roman prosperity sat on this foundation, and any accurate account of Roman women's lives has to include the enslaved women who made the domina's household management possible. Beauty, medicine, and deliberate poisoning. The Roman beauty industry was sophisticated, extensive, and frequently toxic in ways nobody at the time could identify. Roman women of means spent considerable time and money on cosmetics, skincare, hair, and fragrance, using products that ranged from effective to genuinely dangerous. Skin whitening was fashionable because pale skin signaled that a woman did not labor outdoors, a class marker. The ingredients included chalk, white lead, and crocodile dung. White lead, cerussite, was poisonous. Regular application would have caused systemic lead poisoning, with symptoms including cognitive decline and eventually death. Rouge came from red ochre or cinnabar, mercuric sulfide, also toxic. The Romans did not know this was happening. The lead and mercury were just doing what they do. Hair was elaborate by preference and challenging by practicality. Wigs and hairpieces were common. Roman women who could afford it supplemented their own hair with hair purchased from enslaved people or imported from conquered Germanic peoples. The stacked curled hairstyles visible on busts of imperial-era women required hours of work by enslaved hairdressers using curling irons heated over coals, and the tools were occasionally used as improvised weapons when a mistress lost patience, according to our sources. Pliny the Elder, who catalogued Roman cosmetics in his Natural History with barely concealed irritation, described a face cream made from placenta, bull bile, and various plant extract. He also documented the Roman perfume trade, which was genuinely global. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, nard from India, resins and flowers from across the Mediterranean. The fact that moralists complained endlessly about women's cosmetic expenditure tells us the spending was real and substantial. Midwifery was an entirely female profession. The physician, Soranus of Ephesus, addressed his 2nd century gynecological handbook, Gynecia, to midwives, which tells us who was actually doing the work. Women also practiced medicine beyond midwifery. We have grave inscriptions recording women as medica, meaning physician. The gap between who wrote the medical texts and who delivered medical care to women was large and persistent. Contraception, and what the Romans actually knew. Given that childbirth was genuinely dangerous, maternal mortality was high, dying in childbirth was a standard concern rather than an unusual tragedy. Roman interest in contraception was completely rational, and Roman knowledge on the subject was more developed than typically assumed. Soranus of Ephesus devoted substantial sections of his gynecological work to contraceptive methods, which he carefully distinguished from abortifacients. He preferred prevention to termination on the grounds that it was safer for the woman's health. He recommended wool pessaries soaked in olive oil, cedar resin, or white lead. He suggested herbal drinks from pomegranate pulp or galbanum. The white lead recommendation was, again, inadvertently poisonous, but the principle of physical and chemical barriers was correct. Silphium, a plant from Cyrene in North Africa, was so valued as a contraceptive and a culinary seasoning that Rome imported it in enormous quantities and apparently drove it to extinction through overharvesting by the 1st century CE. Its image appeared on Cyrenian coins. Pliny the Elder noted that the last known stock was sent to Nero, who ate it out of curiosity. Whatever its actual efficacy, the Romans believed in it enough to trade it to extinction, which is one of history's more expensive medical endorsements. Abortion was legally unregulated in Rome for most of its history. No law banned it. The philosophical debate existed, but Roman law treated the fetus as part of the mother's body, not a separate legal entity, until Christian-influenced legislation appeared in the 4th century CE under Constantine. This did not make abortion safe or socially consequence-free, but it was not illegal. A distinction that consistently surprises modern readers who assume Roman conservatism must have included legal restrictions on abortion. The Vestal Virgins, freedom through renunciation. The 6 Vestal Virgins were, legally, the most privileged women in Rome, and they achieved that status by giving up everything that defined ordinary Roman womanhood: marriage, family, sexual life. The irony is almost architectural. Girls were chosen between ages 6 and 10 in a process called captio. Capture. The Pontifex Maximus selected from suitable candidates, freeborn, both parents living, physically and mentally sound. Being chosen was compulsory. Families who refused risked divine retribution and social ruin. The girl was installed in the House of the Vestals in the Roman Forum for a 30-year term, 10 years learning the rites, 10 years performing them, 10 years teaching. In exchange for 30 years of celibacy and service to Vesta, goddess of the hearth and Rome's sacred fire, a Vestal received privileges no other woman in Rome possessed. She was freed from her father's patria potestas and needed no tutor for financial transactions. She had reserved seating at public games. Her person was sacrosanct. Attacking her was a capital offense. She could pardon a condemned criminal simply by encountering them on the way to execution. She traveled in a special carriage, preceded by lictors, and consuls stepped aside when she passed. The sacred fire was not symbolic. Romans believed that if the fire went out, disaster would follow. Wills of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Augustus were all deposited with the Vestals, whose custody was considered inviolable. The penalty for a Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was being buried alive outside the city walls with a small supply of food and a lamp. Technically, no Roman hands shed her blood. The man involved was flogged to death in the Comitium. At least 10 Vestals were condemned over Roman history, and several of those condemnations coincided conveniently with political crises that needed a scapegoat. After 30 years, a Vestal was free to leave and marry. Almost none did. When you have been your own legal agent for 3 decades, the appeal of placing yourself under a husband's authority must have seemed limited. The women who refused to stay in the background. Roman political history is formally a history of men, and also, on closer inspection, substantially a history of women operating just outside the frame of official records. Fulvia, wife of Mark Antony, was one of the most remarkable political actors of the late Republic. While Antony was in Egypt with Cleopatra after the Battle of Philippi, Fulvia stayed in Italy and ran his political operations. When Octavian moved to distribute land to his veterans in 41 BCE, Fulvia and Antony's brother Lucius raised 8 legions and fought a war against him. She held Perugia under siege. She lost. The Perisine War ended in defeat, and she died in Greece in 40 BCE. But the fact that a Roman woman raised and commanded legions in a civil war, even through her husband's political authority, is extraordinary. Octavian's propaganda painted her as a monstrous masculine aberration. Propaganda targeting something that never existed is rarely that elaborate. Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, worked differently. Augustus's public image was built on restoring traditional values, which required Livia to be publicly presented as the ideal Roman matron, modest, domestically focused, wool-working. The private reality was a close political partnership. Livia maintained her own network of clients and dependents, advocated for people she wished to protect or promote, and after Augustus's death, continued to exercise influence during Tiberius's reign until he found it intolerable. Tiberius refused her the title, Mother of the Fatherland, and eventually stopped seeing her. After her death, Claudius, her grandson, had her deified. Eumacia of Pompeii was not an empress. She was a wealthy businesswoman and public priestess in a provincial city who funded the largest building in the Pompeian Forum in the 1st century CE, dedicated to Concordia and Pietas, the conventional female virtues, but built with her own money and bearing her name prominently. She was the most publicly prominent citizen of Pompeii by any material measure. She was a woman, and she is not particularly famous, which tells you something about whose achievements get remembered, what Rome said women were, and what women were actually doing. The Roman ideal of femininity can be reconstructed from the texts. Chaste, modest, devoted to household and husband, skilled in wool, work, fertile, quiet. These virtues were celebrated in funeral speeches, inscribed on tombstones, praised in poetry. The model Roman woman was Lucretia, who killed herself after being raped because she could not bear to survive with her honor gone. Her death, in the Roman founding myth, justified the overthrow of the kings and the establishment of the Republic. She was the woman whose suffering built civilization. The actual record of Roman women includes shopkeepers, ship captains, physicians, poets, businesswomen, gladiatrices. A small number of inscriptions and stone reliefs document female gladiators, classified as spectacle rather than sport, but real, political operatives, religious leaders, and women who divorced multiple husbands with apparent equanimity. The moralists, Juvenal, Pliny the Elder, various philosophers, complained relentlessly about Roman women who attended chariot races with too much enthusiasm, spent too much on clothes, drank wine, technically prohibited for women in the early Republic, a prohibition that had collapsed completely by the late Republic but was nostalgically invoked anyway, exercised too much, read too much, and generally refused to perform the Lucretia their culture kept insisting they should be. The volume and repetition of these complaints is itself evidence. You do not write elaborate screeds about behavior that nobody is engaging in. Every moralist complaint is also, inadvertently, a census of what was actually happening. Real Roman women were at the races, reading philosophy, managing money, initiating divorces, and declining to apologize for any of it. Rome gave women a complicated hand, legally subordinate but practically powerful in households and business, officially modest but visibly influential in politics, ideally quiet but actually present in the historical record in ways that keep turning up when historians look. The women who spun wool for Augustus's household were performing a traditional virtue. The women who owned the mills were building an economy. Both were Roman women, and the empire ran on both.